thanks to all of you for being here today. This is actually our second session of the day. We had 6 candidates in this morning. It was a good conversation, went for an hour and a half. We'll do the same now. A couple of things I just want to explain to you. One is I wanted to say thanks for being patient with us. A few of the campaigns have called us in the last few weeks, said, you know, when are you guys doing your thing? And we kept putting you off. And we did it for 2 reasons. One is we're hoping some of you would drop out. And
I've been trying to get them.
Thank you.
you know, I'm not saying who, but we thought, you know, a smaller group would be easier to interview. And secondly, we thought maybe if we did a poll, that would show you really where the action is, the front runners, and who you really needed to talk to. And we came to the conclusion after doing a poll that that's not a good idea. That first of all, the numbers didn't show such a clear 2 or 3 front runners that we thought we could do that. And secondly, a lot of really good people would not have been invited. So we decided now, late in the game, to have these 2 sessions today. So thanks for doing that. And the second thing I wanted to point out is why this grouping as opposed to the morning grouping. And Marilyn and I sat down in my office about a week ago and we pulled names out of a hat. And that's how we pulled this off. So blame fate if you have problems with that. So with that, we'll just get right to it. We're not going to do opening remarks, stump speeches. You guys have all done that enough. And I'll just turn it to Marilyn.
Thank you. This is a question about revenue, and we'll start with County Board President Toni Preckwinkle. Given the soda tax and the way you restored the sales tax that you had previously cut, the concern among some voters is that you are more likely than others to raise taxes. Is that unfair? How do you see it?
You know, we clearly face some fiscal challenges in the city of Chicago, and we have to look at them through an equity lens. You know, I've always spoken for the need of a progressive income tax in the state of Illinois. That's the fairest way to raise revenue, and it's an option that's available to the state and not at local units of government. A progressive income tax not only gives the state additional revenue, but it also provides revenue for local units of government through the local government distributive fund. So that's the first thing that I always talk about. And secondly, you know, this is going to be a situation where there's shared sacrifice. I've talked about tax increment financing districts and the ways in which we have abused that economic development tool. 31% of our property tax revenues now goes into these sequestered TIF districts. That's not sustainable over the long term. We also need to look at workman's comp, where the county has 22,000 employees and spends $20 million on workman's comp. The city has 10,000 more employees and spends $100 million on workman's comp. When I came into office in 2010, we had a $487 million gap to close in our budget. And I brought the 11 separately elected officials in and said, this is going to be shared sacrifice. And we made 15% cuts in the budgets of all of our separately elected officials. We refinanced some of our debts. We looked at a variety of options. There are no silver bullets. There's no magic to this. As I said, it's going to be shared sacrifice. We're going to have to look at a lot of different options. We face some real challenges, but those are challenges that I've addressed as president of the county. In the last 8 years, I've closed budget gaps of $2.1 billion. We made $850 million in cuts. We reduced our workforce by 13% and our indebtedness by 11%. So I've taken on tough challenges before and addressed them.
So what did you learn out of the way the soda tax kind of backfired? What did you learn from that?
Well, you know, we needed revenue, and it's clear that this was not popular, and this is a representative government, and so it was repealed. And we made the very difficult decisions that we had to make. We eliminated 1,000 positions in the county, 1,000 positions, balanced our budget, and moved forward.
I want to ask a follow-up on the state income tax. Who's to say that the state is going to give us, you know, they face fiscal problems themselves, and then if we could hear from the others on their ideas as well.
Yeah,
Let me just say that
somebody else about how can you be confident the state will come up with a progressive income tax? Tony, Gery?
Yes. Look, I'm for a progressive income tax. We just need to know what the schedules are. I don't want to hurt working families any more than we already hurt. And to President Preckwinkle's comment, anybody who assumes the office of mayor is going to have to take on a very, very difficult circumstances. So the issue that I've worried about the longest is the impulse to just tax and tax and tax and tax. think people are up to hear, Tom, in my conversations with them around the city. We have to be very, very careful in how we raise revenue, which is why I spent a lot of time thinking about how we could raise revenue without putting it on the backs of our citizens. I've talked about these downtown skyscrapers.
Why do you mention Toni Preckwinkle specifically? Are you
Because
critical of her for raising the sales tax?
well, look, I've not been shy about this. I think that it's important that we not have anybody in there who's going to have the impulse to hit us on a soda tax again. And it's not just soda. Look, it's not just soda. It's Gatorade, it's Frappuccino.
Soda tax, clearly.
Well, I don't know. Gatorade, Frappuccino, coffee drinks, all of these things were taxed. That's why there was the massive backlash that you saw.
We have to let Toni respond. You said she has an impulse to tax.
No, the way in which we addressed our $487 million gap when I walked in the door was the first thing we did was reduce our expenses. As I said, 15% cuts in the budget of every separately elected official, 15% cuts. And we refinanced some of our debt. Those were the ways in which we made up most of the $487 million gap. And as I said, over the last 8 years, $2.1 billion in budget gaps closed, $850 million in cuts, 13% cut in our workforce, and 11% cut in our indebtedness. I think that's a record that can't be matched in the city or the state.
Let's go to Paul. He's been.
I want to speak to this issue of the progressive income tax. And incidentally, if anybody thinks that, by taxing downtown skyscrapers, you're suddenly going to solve the pension problem, it's another easy thing. It's an easy, it's a diversion. It's a shiny object. At the end of the day, if you're going to address the pension funding issue, you're going to need a serious state agenda, and you're going to need a serious budget cutting agenda. And, when I took over the Chicago Public Schools, and the BGA did one of their patented facts checks. And when we closed a $1.4 billion structural deficit over 4 years, we did it in many ways the way Toni did it. We went in and we eliminated unnecessary spending. We reduced contractual obligations, et cetera. But let me speak to the progressive income tax. You can make the income tax progressive without going to a constitutional amendment by simply using tax credits and tax exemptions. So because the Constitution requires that the tax be uniform. So if you have tax credits that are uniform and you cap those tax credits, you can literally take almost half, if not more, of the voters out of the increases, and you can provide lower income voters with significant tax relief. That's number one. Number two, because Toni spoke to the issue of fair share, there are two funds that funnel money to local governments. Now, we have a Democratic veto-proof majority in the House and Senate, and Susana will tell you this, we've got a Democratic governor, right? Well, we should expect that they're going to stop diverting $300 million in local and corporate personal property tax revenues away from local governments. That's counties and municipalities and schools. And we should have at least expect that if they're going to raise the income tax, that they not play with the local government distributive fund. The local government distributive fund says that local governments get a share of the income tax increases. And what happened the last two times is nobody went down to Springfield and lobbied to make sure that the legislature at the last minute didn't jingle with that fund or play with that fund to keep local governments from getting money. So if you did those two things for Chicago, it would generate between $275 and $300 million in additional revenues, which would address almost 1/3 of your long-term pension obligation.
But the reality is, the progressive income tax, whether it comes online or doesn't come online, it's not going to happen soon enough to address the immediate needs in Chicago. We have to, and also the thing that nobody's talked about yet is we can't go back to the taxpayers on top of the largest property tax increase, the regressive fines, taxes, and fees that we've imposed on people, and say, by the way, before we've done anything else, we want the extra change in your pocket. We can't do that. We have to build a case for revenue. Revenue is obviously going to be something on the table, but we've got to deal with the inefficiencies that are already existing in government. If we, for example, tackled the out of control settlements, judgments, and attorneys' fees that we're spending to the tune of $50 to $60 million every year, $500 million over the last 7 years regarding police misconduct, that would yield a substantial amount of income. If we dealt with the fact that every single year we have an enormous overrun and police overtime, in part because, frankly, ROM started too late to rebuild the depleted resources in the police department.
You started your comment by saying, though, that a progressive income tax is great. I think everybody here probably supports it, but won't come online soon enough. You have to do
That's right.
something sooner.
And neither will the
But the
casino,
example of
neither will the
using-
legalization of
The
marijuana.
example of using reduction in police settlements against the police department, that's not going to happen anytime soon either. There are
Well,
cases in the pipeline. of the
I disagree with that, actually.
Really?
I think there are things that are in place that frankly, if the city and the police department are true to the consent decree, we can start to see some of those changes this year. And frankly, there's no reason to wait. I've been talking for the last 2 years about the lack of urgency with the mayor and the corporation council to get a hold on these out of control expenses that are draining resources and frankly delegitimizing the police department. So there's no reason for us to wait. We could start doing something about this right now today.
We make changes, but they will not show up. They will not
Thank
show
you,
up
Toni.
immediately because these cases takes years to work their way through the courts. We just had a settlement for the Englewood Four, which was $24 million.
Right.
And that was several years ago.
Yeah, but that's
we
because
want to give
frankly you had
someone else
somebody
a chance
in
to
charge.
chime
Yes,
in on
thank you.
this, so
Good
we want to
idea.
start on
You know,
this end.
I
Mr.
do
Fioretti.
believe the problem that we're faced with, whoever gets sworn in by May 15th, by September 1st, has to find $300 million. $400 million. $400 million is what we're faced with. I know the Tribune throws around a figure of 200 and the numbers have shifted a couple of times. How do we find $400 million for the pension fund for this year and 600 after that and 800 and then $1 billion?
Right.
And so we have $2 billion in 4 years that we're paying into our pension fund. 6 years ago, I did propose the commuter tax, 1% on all the people that come into this city from suburbs, from Indiana, Wisconsin, would generate $300 million. It's a question of equity. It's a question of fairness. It doesn't chase people out. It in fact stabilizes our own economy here. And it creates a system that those that come into the city contribute. They want safe streets. They want good neighborhoods. They want an ambulance if they're having a heart attack before they hit the ground. They want that ambulance there. We need to look at what we can do. And that's $300 million. Video poker, we can raise it. And I know your paper said something about, well, it's subject to this. Well, there are startup costs, but it would probably, the people I've talked to would generate about $75 million in the first year. So we, lift the ban, highly regulated, and see what we can do. If we can't find $25 million more out of the first year, and Paul is right, we need a legislative agenda in Springfield, and we need one in DC to help us solve this problem.
So
Mr.
I would
Ford
thank you,
chime
Mary
in.
Mitchell, and thank the entire, I would think that what we hear from all of the candidates here is more the same. I mean, the problem that we have to deal with the machine politics that has destroyed communities and families for many years. We have to deal with the racism and discrimination in this city that's costing taxpayers and the city too much money. Here we are, Black History Month, and 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, Chicago is still the most segregated city in the country, and that's too bad. These things really drags the Chicago economy down. I've heard what Lori said. She's absolutely right to a certain degree. We have to stop wasting our taxpayer dollars. So we could continue to try to raise money, but we're only going to raise money to pay for corruption in this city. That's why I'm running for mayor, because we're going to destroy those machine politics in this city.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the word corruption, because that's a segue into where our
Mary,
next question.
I really would love to.
You're going to get the question.
Great, thank
You're going to get the question. So if you want to chime in on the last
I wanna
questions,
deal with
and
that
you get the
comments.
first question.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I
Mhm.
appreciate that. When it comes to the issue of the looming pension payment, which is really the most critical thing that we're going to jump into right after being sworn in. Unless if somebody knows where there's $400 million laying under a rock somewhere, we have to deal with the pressing question of cash now. I have been the controller for the state of Illinois and championed a bonding deal that saved taxpayers between $4 and $6 billion. And while the particulars of that are different than the scenario that we're looking at with the city, it's still important to not throw the bonding deal out as a potential financial tool that we should be looking at, because it's the quickest way to have immediate cash flow to make that payment.
You're
I
talking
think
about the pension obligation bond?
Yes, exactly. I think we need to be honest though with the public and transparent as to how that would work. I don't believe that a $10 billion bond deal with zero transparency is the way to go. But I think that one of the things that I've proven as controller is that I believe in full transparency when it comes to the finances and laying out the groundwork for the public as to, is it a $2 billion? Is it a $5 billion? Is it a $7 billion? What the risk and what the return would be, because we do need immediate cash, and a casino isn't going to happen fast. Marijuana isn't going to happen fast. Neither is, of course, a progressive income tax, all of which I support. But nonetheless, those are long-term options versus a short-term need for cash.
But the problem is that the very idea of the pension obligation bond, as you said, hasn't been transparent.
Right.
There
That's
hasn't been
I totally agree with you.
there hasn't
We're on
been
the same
sufficient
page. So that's
information.
exactly what I'm saying.
That
The reason why
And it's been a
hold on.
disaster in
But
Detroit
the
and
reason
Stockton
why,
and the state of
but it
Illinois.
hasn't been, for example,
not
with what
in
we've done at the
Wisconsin.
state level. Can I?
Ms. Mendoza.
Yes. Would love to
here's-
answer this because I
here's
feel
where
like
we're
this is
trying
my
to
sweet
go
spot.
here on this question.
Totally.
After everything that you said,
Yes.
whether you're talking about taxes or bonds or any of that, it all boils down to whether the taxpayer believes that their money is being used properly.
Exactly,
And
which is
that-
why
that-
I have
that's not
ushered
into a
in
system of corruption.
No,
So
totally.
my
But
next question, which you can
I
answer
can answer
first.
that. I'll finish answering that.
Yes,
part.
the
Thank
next
you.
question that you can answer first has to do with what would each of you do to end the corruption that we're seeing coming out of headlines like we've seen
Of course.
in the last week with Alderman Ed Burke. You yourself have said that you would give back over $100,000 because of the tapes with Danny Solis's name on it. So these are things that taxpayers are really concerned about.
Mhm.
What would you do to end that type of corruption or the perception that there's outright corruption in City Hall?
Well, great question. And to finish the other question, because they kind of both correlate here, is that I think that the hallmark of my transparency as controller has been to usher in a transparency revolution. And that's going to be critically important to getting buy-in from the public on anything. What I won't do when talking about revenue sources is pass regressive taxes the way President Preckwinkle has. The soda tax was a bad idea, and she still defended it just a few months ago. And yes, we're not going to ever have a soda tax in Chicago anymore because the people won't allow it, and we have to listen to the people.
Right.
I don't
So
support.
what would you do?
What
would you
I
do?
don't support regressive, I should say, taxes like a sales tax, a parking app tax that just got passed again this last month. I mean, so this is lazy governance. What I will do though, what I will do is put forth what I have, the most comprehensive anti-corruption, ethics, and accountability plan of any of the mayoral candidates, because we have to get to the root cause of why most of the aldermen end up going to jail, and that's aldermanic prerogative. And any candidate who believes that we should be defending still aldermanic prerogative with what we see in the climate that we're living in is just totally tone deaf. The fact that their unchecked power exists to the degree that it does is something that needs to stop. And President Preckwinkle still defends aldermanic prerogative, and that needs to stop. Along with
So President
allowing,
Preckwinkle, I'm sorry,
Yes,
President Preckwinkle,
Sure.
could you respond to that?
Sure. Look, there should be no tolerance for corruption in city government. Absolutely none. And the first thing I should say is that I've given back all the money that was raised at the fundraiser. And secondly, let me just say, I've taken the strongest position against Ed Burke, the strongest position. I've said that he should resign as chairman of the finance committee. I've said that he should resign as committeeman and alderman of the 14th ward. And I made it quite clear that I stripped him of his position as chairman of the judicial slating committee in the party. And let me just say, the real challenge, thank you, let me finish. The real challenge is that we can't allow dual employment of our city elected officials. We shouldn't have to wonder whether or not the elected official is serving their clients or their constituents. And let me just say, if Ed Burke is guilty of the allegations against him, he should be in jail. I think it's really important that people have confidence in their government.
Can I ask you about one other important point? Since you brought up the issue of Ed Burke and that specifically, he went to you and asked you if you could find a job for his son, Ed Burke Jr., and you passed that person's name on to somebody within your administration. He was hired. And in my experience, when someone passes along a name like that, the message to people, whether it's stated or not, and whether you intended it or not, is that, I should hire that person. And he was hired. He turned out to be a bust. Can you respond to that?
Well, let me just say, Ed Burke had been an employee of the county for 20 years, most recently in the sheriff's office. His resume went to the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, where he was found qualified and hired in a very similar position to the one that he held in the sheriff's office.
Were you
He was
troubled
qualified.
that, were you
He was
troubled though that a
qualified for the
powerful
position.
alderman would come, were you troubled that a powerful alderman like Ed Burke would come to you and make that request, knowing how politics works in Chicago?
Let me just say, I had my staff check. I had 1,000 meetings last year, 1,000 meetings. Staff, community-based organizations, constituents, elected officials. I think it's really important to be open and accessible. And I meet with pretty much everybody who asks to meet with me, because I think it's really important that government and elected officials be available to their constituents. People have to have confidence. People have to have confidence in their government. And one way that they can have confidence is that their elected officials are open and accessible. And let me just say, let me finish. Because I talk to people all the time, it gives me a better handle on the challenges both that the city and the county face. And, when I talk to people, the biggest challenge that they talk to me about is opportunity in their own communities. And that's something I've tried to address with support for small and medium-sized businesses and plans to support them that have been released over the last couple of weeks.
Your question was, how do we get to the root of this problem? Let me say this, if I might. We all pretty much share the agenda that we need to ban outside income, end aldermanic prerogative, and I've thrown in the concept of term limits. None of that is going to be done by the City Council of Chicago. Forget about it. I've proposed the Chicago Voter Initiative. Let's go to the ultimate bosses in this city and put it before them. If you think the City Council is going to cut off its own power, we're all sadly mistaken. You need to take this matter to the voters and have them pass a binding referendum.
Everything that you're talking about now,
I've been
everything
talking about
that
for a
everything
long
that
time.
President
You're right,
Preckwinkle
Lori.
just said,
You're right.
she only did after the scandal broke. And frankly, with due respect, Madam President, the minute that Ed Burke's offices were seized, I remember it happened on Thursday. On a Friday, I was out in public. Everybody else was silent. What I said back in August is people should not be able to monetize their position. We should take back the workers' compensation program. Of course, and then when I called upon you multiple times to bar Ed Burke from slating judges, finally it was done. So you asked a question about what's it going to take? It's going to take a leader. I'm a former federal prosecutor who convicted and sent to prison a corrupt alderman. And why I think people are resonating with the things that we're talking about is because I have walked the walk long before the scandal happened. It's one thing when you're caught and the public red hot glare is on you to propose all sorts of things, but it's another what you do on a day-to-day basis and what you propose and what you've called for and what you stand for.
That's right.
I'm glad that all these people are joining.
Let me just say, I have not ever held an outside office since 1991 when I was first elected. And I think it's critical for our elected officials not to have dual employment.
Then do it now with the county.
And it's more critical to get.
Okay, folks, you know what? We have to be fair.
Let me
Lori,
just say,
I would like to answer.
let me
We have
just
to be
say,
fair to the other candidates. Let's
We
hear
should
from
go back
Shawn
to
Ford.
Why we're in this position in Chicago. In 2006, I ran and won my office as state representative with my own money. I'm still in debt with that money because I'm not connected to the machine in any way. And so what we have to do is take a break from the machine politics of Chicago if we want to give Chicago a fair shot at healing and getting away from this corruption. It's impossible for us to move forward in Chicago and heal if we have the same players at the table. Now, just imagine, I'm sitting here honored to be at the table to run for mayor because I fought on my own dime. And I fought and I worked hard as a state
Shawn, I have to
representative
think
to
it's
get
more
here.
than just changing the people because
We have to change the
I know
people.
little Chicago history, and I don't think we've ever had a really honest city council for 150 years.
We honest city council, but you have to have an honest mayor that's going to lead this city in the right direction. That's the problem that we have. We need a mayor that understands that this city is racist
You know,
to a degree
and-
and corrupted, and that's
Tom-
willing to face that head on. If you don't
Right.
face it head on, we're not going to change
That's
the
right.
city.
Tom, all of these
We did that. Some of us in the city council stood up. I mean, you talked about Leon Dupre recently in the editorial. I was fighting for the same things that all these people now are talking about. We even proposed a map that slimmed down the city council to 35 during the remap. We lost by one vote. It would have gone to the voters then to decide. We had one vote less. We've been talking, some of us been talking about term limits, getting rid of aldermanic privilege, cutting down the size of the city council for quite a long time. We were trying to make sure that the inspector general had enough money. I'm not sure if this inspector general can do the job. I think the council needs its own inspector general too.
I'd like to say one thing here. I do think that this is important, Tom and everybody else here at the board. The fact that anyone would be here right now still trying to shift away from needing to get rid of aldermanic privilege is just, again, tone deaf. All of the other stuff is window dressing. There's a lot of great ideas for reforms, but if we don't get to the root of what the problem is with corruption in city council, and that's aldermanic privilege, whether we do it through citizen initiative or whether the mayor, myself, will take away whatever historically has been given that's not codified, that has to happen. But truth of the matter is this thinking is the thinking of the past, not your thinking. Yeah, let me just say, hold on, let me finish this one point, guys. Yes.
So I tell you what, let's hear from Paul Vallas. And Paul, let's phrase the question. Paul, Susana.
This is the thinking of the past.
Please, we have to move
Toni,
on.
I'm sure you don't want to keep talking about aldermanic prerogative, but here's the thing. This is the thinking of the past, and we need to move toward the future. Yes.
So Paul,
please give us your version.
I'd like to rephrase the question though. Earlier in this morning's session, Bill Daley's solution was absolutely, this is why we have to reduce the size of the city council. That changes their role, and if you change their role, it changes the whole culture and dynamic of the city council. What's your take?
Look, I was in Alderman Moore's district in the Englewood area, and he has more students. I mean, his students. I'm talking like a school superintendent again. He has more constituents than the city of Calumet, and they have 7 aldermen. It's not how many aldermen you have; it's the power that you give them. It's the budget that you give them. It's that pay-to-play culture that you engender through aldermanic privilege. So, I've said from the beginning that you've got to get rid of aldermanic privilege. You need term limits, and the mayor can do this himself through the weight he can bring on the city council. You've got to limit these committee chairs to 1 term. Now, look, no one can ever accuse me of being part of this pay-to-play culture. I took all the construction projects out of the Public Building Commission so I could do 50% minority and business and 50% minority hiring. And I ran against Rob Blagojevich, and a number of people at this table right here did not endorse me. In fact, none of the establishment did. And when you're part of the pay-to-play culture, you don't go to New Orleans to rebuild schools after Katrina, and you certainly don't go to Haiti and Chile after those earthquakes. So if you're going to be serious about changing the landscape, you've got to do it institutionally, because the pay-to-play culture, the unlimited terms, the unlimited ability to earn outside income, not only if you're an elected official, but what about these individuals who get on these boards and then they steer either directly or indirectly contracts to their law firms? So at the end of the day, you need the type of real ethics reform that is going to take the money out of the system, because it's the money that has a corrupting influence.
And that's campaign finance. That's what the problem is. No matter
before
who
we move
or
on
what,
to campaign
they're the
finance,
ones.
I want to just, I got to have a follow-up for what Mr. Vallas said. So when you were head of Chicago Public Schools, and Mr. Chico, you were head of the board, right?
Yeah.
There were some good things that came out of it. There were some bad things that came out of it. The good that came out of it, of course, was that you were able to make some reforms and some headway on reforms. But the bad thing that came out of it, one of them was the fact that there was a pension holiday, that we're in the mess that we're in now because pension payments were drastically reduced. That's one thing. And then the second thing that came out of it, and this goes to you, Mr. Chico, was the fact that your law firm was able to get so much business from the Board of Education that you had to abstain from voting 400 times.
Sure.
So tell me how then you would be as mayor any different from what we've seen in the past? And I will start with Vallas and then to you.
Let me speak to the pension holiday, and I'm going to try to speak slower, because I have a tendency to explain this very fast. In 1995, when the law was enacted, giving the mayor control over the schools, the legislature included in that law, and incidentally was strongly supported by the Chicago Teachers Union. Follow me on this, please, because it's really important.
I'm following.
No. So they included a provision that basically said this meager property tax levy that generated $60-70 million a year, and it was a fixed levy. So in other words, the pension fund could have been $1 billion in structural deficit, and that levy would not have grown more than the natural growth in property taxes. They said, we're going to consolidate all the property tax levies into a single levy, but we're going to have a provision in that law. And that provision says that you have to fund pensions based on an actuarially based formula, which means if you need $200 million, you put $200 million in. If you need $300 million, you put $300 million in. When we left, the system was 104% funded. In 2004, 3 years after we left, when the system fell below 90%, they started to put money in. Now, let me tell you what happens. In 2010, they passed a pension holiday, for all the city pension funds, fire, police, municipal. When I left the budget office, our municipal retirement system was 90% funded, and our laborers were 133% funded. So the point is, I am going to fulfill my obligations to fully fund the pensions. That is why I have prepared a comprehensive plan, which you cited in your editorial when you were talking about it, on how I'm going to do that without raising taxes.
So if you had to do it all over again, you would do it the same way? Is that what you're saying?
I think what I'm doing is eliminating a flat subsidy of $60-70 million a year, which really, for all practical purposes, wouldn't have changed, and replacing it with an actuarial formula was a much healthier approach to take. And the proof is in the pudding. We're at 104% funded.
And Mr. Chico?
To echo what Paul said, yes, we do the same thing again. I think the record speaks for itself. We walked into a calamity of a $1.3 billion projected deficit and walked out with probably a $500 million surplus. So let me answer your question about
Right.
about 400 votes, right? That was 400 votes against 12,000 that were taken. I was a part of 2 international law firms with a lot of partners, and anytime anything came up that remotely looked like it might be a conflict, I felt in the interest of transparency to put it on the record, and let everybody see it. Nothing was hidden. It was absolutely the way you follow the rules. But I think the point of the matter is this. The time that I'm happy and I'm proud of the time that Paul and I put in at the Chicago Public Schools, I think it was viewed as a model for the nation. Don't believe me. It was Bill Clinton and Secretary Riley.
But how do you explain your law firm going from 18 clients with CPS to 200?
First of all,
How do you explain that?
It's not even true.
Well, that's what's published. That's
Well,
what's been written.
That doesn't make it
So
true.
it's saying,
went
you're
from
saying
being
that
a law firm to
it's
a
been an
public-
error. That was an error, a 25-year-old error.
Yes.
You know, when they continue to say,
What are the facts? Did your firm get an increased number?
You're
of clients
talking
from
about,
CPS?
Tom, for example, you're talking about Commonwealth Edison. They want to give me credit for the electricity bills of 700 buildings throughout the CPS because someone in my firm, this huge firm, did some work for Commonwealth Edison. I don't think that's fair.
I'm happy to hear them talk about their successes with the Chicago Public Schools, but living on the west side and you look at the south side, Austin, North Lawndale, Inglewood, I just don't see where their successes really trickle down to the communities because the incarceration rate continued to rise. I think what we know is that they had successes because a lot of their cronies got contracts with CPS, but it did not trickle down to Black people and brown people in this city. And so if they want to continue to talk about their successes, let's talk about human capital successes, and we don't have it.
You know, I have to respond to that because, first of all, I've never had any side businesses. And of course, you know, going to Philadelphia and New Orleans and Haiti, the bottom line is I haven't even taken my pension yet, as meager as it is, because you don't get pensions for going to those places. So please don't confuse. I don't think I was there long enough. But the bottom line is, but let me just say something. Let me just say something about the successes. Because number one, we not only closed a massive structural deficit, $1.4 billion, and left them with $1 billion in cash balances, but we raised teacher salaries during that period 17%, and we never closed a single school, not a single school.
You don't have to close
And
them.
let me
I'm
finish.
sorry, Paul.
You made your comments. Let me respond. This isn't the other forum. Let me respond.
I'm sorry.
So we never closed a single school. Let me tell you what else we did. I kept all of our schools open to anywhere from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock at night because I not only fed children 3 meals a day, I not only provided health care, I not only provided coats and eyeglasses when the kids failed their eye exams because I tested them, but when kids were victims of violence in their own community, I went out and I raised the money to pay for those funerals. Let me also say something else. By taking all the school construction projects out of the Public Building Commission, I tore down every prefab school in this city and replaced it with a brick and mortar school. And we just didn't build Northside College Prep. We built Peyton before Cabrini Green was torn down. And we built Jones and Lindblom. And Carver Military Academy and Simeon. And I built 78 brand new buildings, and 80% of those buildings were in poor communities. I bought Mendel and converted it to Guadalupe Brooks. And one final thing, 58% of every one I hired on school construction projects and over 45% on professional services were Black and Latino. There is no one on the planet who has those statistics. So I'm not saying everything was perfect. I'm not saying the schools were thriving, but Mary, 4 years after I left, they did the total abomination. It was called Renaissance 2010. And they went in 2004. I was in my third year in Philadelphia. And they said, we're going to close 100 schools, reopen them as charters, and disperse the kids to the surrounding communities. So that's one thing. That's when they began to lose the 70,000 students, fewer students that they have today than they had when I was there.
Eric, can I say something?
I'd like to, in light of, because it's kind of, you guys are on the end here and we're having in light of everything that's going on with the school system now, do all of you in the middle sort of buy that argument? Where do you see our schools as at now and the path that Paul and Gery sent them on?
I think the real challenge that our schools face is that we haven't made equitable investments in them. You know, you can determine someone's life expectancy by their zip code, and now you can also determine the quality of the schooling that's available to the young people in those communities by their zip code. And we have schools that are well-resourced and schools that are not well-resourced. And we've put a lot of energy and resources into charter schools and magnet and selective schools. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't look at those as options. I'm only saying that we need to improve the neighborhood public schools. And you can, as I said, you can pretty much tell whether or not a school is resourced by the zip code. And that's a real challenge. And I agree with Paul that there was a real watershed, a sea change in 2004. And we stopped investing in our neighborhood public schools in the way that we desperately need to. We cannot have a strong city if we don't have good schools in all of our communities. There's no way.
The most important investment that we can make is in our children. And I spent the last 2 years of my life here traveling the entire state of Illinois, fighting for greater funding for not just Chicago public schools, but for kids across Illinois, and specifically to bring an additional $70 million in equity funding with the new funding formula for Chicago public schools. Now, as the mother of a kindergartner in CPS, this will be the first time in my lifetime that we have a mayor of Chicago who actually has their own child in the CPS system. And I think that's critically important for parents to know out there, that every decision that I'll make regarding our educational system is going to be viewed through the prism of, does this help us to close the achievement gap? And I've set a very bold goal of closing that achievement gap by 50% in the next 8 years. Now, hold on, let me just finish this because this is important. Like, can I,
on this
guys, seriously,
issue, because it's nonsense.
It's not funding. We're going to have $70 million in new dollars.
As a number.
No,
it's
they're not.
Beyond that. So it's how we develop wraparound programs,
which is part of my Future Now plan, which I wanted to get into before you.
In my ward, I found money for each and every school. I found public-private partnerships with the schools, and at the same time, we need to have mentoring programs for these kids. Look, South Loop. One night had 350 students. They raised $117,000 for their kids. William King, right past Western on Florinite, right off of Harrison. They were all, and twice the number of kids, a great principal, black and brown, but all they were able to raise was $5,000 on their parents' then. It's a lot more than just saying, we're going to shovel the money into the school. It's how we direct
Exactly,
it and
which is
what
why
we need to do.
the equity dollars are supposed to go specifically to that, to the areas that need it the most. And that's why my 50 New initiative, which is what I rolled out as part of my Future Now plan, is very important to Chicagoans. They need to know about it because what we're going to do is we're going to identify the 50 most underutilized, under-resourced schools in the city of Chicago Public School System, most of which are on the west and the south side in the highest areas of poverty and violence. And we're going to keep those schools open. I know, I understand, but we have to start somewhere. So the 50 New initiative, if you just let me finish explaining it, is going to provide those wraparound services. So we're going to keep the school open longer. We'll be able to provide school supper. I'm the one who passed the school breakfast bill in the state of Illinois. That's why kids get breakfast across this entire state. And we're also going to allow for the schools to stay open and provide wraparound services from the different social service providers in the community. And make sure,
let's move on to
another. We're not just targeting those equity dollars
No,
to children.
let's move on
but
to
also
another
to
issue.
The parents who I believe need to,
Let's
if
move-
we can, we've got vacant
Let's
space in
move
these
on
schools.
because, but let's move on to
I
another
just feel like
issue.
I'm not, okay, very good.
Yeah.
I just think this is an important use of reallocation of limited dollars to really
Okay,
get
well,
effective
Lori,
outcomes.
go ahead.
Well, you know.
You can learn more about it on my website, my Future Now plan.
Lori.
Thanks for the infomercial.
Yes, thanks.
The reality is, if we don't have stability at the top, we've had 5 CEOs in the last 7 years.
That's true.
If we don't have a focus on the quality of life for these kids in the neighborhoods who have to travel outside of their neighborhoods for the promise of a decent school, if we do not have an emphasis on making sure that we've got level 1 and 1+ neighborhood schools, elementary and high school, in every neighborhood that we can get to, none of this matters. Now, part of it is the fact that we haven't had a stable funding stream for the last few years because of the craziness that's going on in Springfield. We've got that stability. We've got to improve our bond ratings when we go into the market. We're actually borrowing at decent rates and not usurious rates. But fundamentally, we've got to have a leader and a leadership team at CPS that focuses on the basic, and we just simply haven't had that kind of stability. There's money in the system, but we're not using it efficiently.
Okay. Wait a second. We just talked about whether or not the leadership at CPS is competent. And I happen to think that Janice Jackson and Frank Clark have done a very fine job.
Do everything
some
behind
very
closed doors.
difficult
They didn't do anything
circumstances
about
and
the sex abuse
finances.
scandal. Gary, I don't even know how you can say that. I don't know how you can say that. They got notice in January, hold on, Paul. They got notice in January of last year that there was a looming sex abuse crisis. 400 cases of kids being abused by teachers, by staff, by coaches, and they sat on it for 5 months, and didn't do anything until after the Tribune broke the story. How do you say that Frank Clark and Janice Jackson are doing a great job with that kind of record? That's embarrassing.
No.
That is embarrassing.
I'll say this.
Gary, teachers were allowed to go from one place to the next.
Let him respond.
Terrible.
Let him respond.
I'll let you speak. I happen to think that Frank Clark and the board there right now, along with Janice Jackson and her team, have done a very, very good job. Nobody is perfect. Nobody is perfect. We do the best we can. When this was brought to their attention, they took action.
No, they didn't, Gary. They got notice on January 18th when the Tribune filed a FOIA request that said, give me all your information on teachers, coaches, other stakeholders who've abused the children. They did nothing. They tried to stiff the Tribune, and then they did nothing until after the Tribune broke the story on June 5th. That's almost 5 months where they didn't do anything to protect kids.
So no matter what Paul Vallas says, so Paul, you get the last word on this. Try to keep it short if you could.
I agree with Lori 100%. And I will tell you, I am really frustrated. Suddenly, Janice Jackson is doing a great job. And I like Janice Jackson, and she's an excellent educator. But I think the jury is still out. Frank Clark, forget it. That whole board needs to go. But I will tell you this. To sit here and suddenly talk about what a great job they're doing, and then at every forum to say at the top of my public safety agenda is I'm going to get rid of Eddie Johnson. Eddie Johnson, who grew up in Cabrini Green. Eddie Johnson, who worked his way up the ranks. Eddie Johnson has been trying to repair the damage done by McCarthy and Rahm Emanuel since he came in. I just think that's
Okay,
disingenuous.
Yeah, we'll get to that later, but this goes to the issue, this question goes to the issue of quality of life, which is, I think, a couple of you mentioned. And it's something we hear a lot of, vague, things that sound great, platitudes about let's bring development to the south and west side. That's great. Let's talk specifics. And let's let LaShawn start first, and
All
then
right.
we'll go to, the rest of you can jump in. But since you brought up segregation and racism, we'll let you go first.
Right now in Chicago, I think it's about 34% of blacks own homes. You have to have a mayor that's going to lead the charge in making sure that the bank and the financial district works with the community. 43% of the Latinos own homes in this city. We have a wealth gap, 48% black and 42% Latino, and the whites is at 18%. Let's talk about the fact that black people in this city, even with advanced degrees, are unemployed compared to the white counterparts. That's not right. We have to have a mayor that's going to deal with this problem head on.
Yeah, with all due respect, those specifics about what you would do, because those are very telling statistics. But what would you, as mayor, do?
You have to lead. The city of Chicago must lead when it comes to employment and contract opportunities with the city. Right now, it's cronyism and it's corruption. Everyday people will never have an opportunity to have their shot at doing business with the city under a machine type government.
I have 19 years of experience working with communities to rebuild them. We worked with community residents. We worked actually with Paul and Gery to improve our public schools. And, we made some great progress. Actually, we created a magnet school in our neighborhood, and we got a lot of improvements, physical improvements in the existing schools that were there. So we worked hard to build our neighborhood schools. If you're going to strengthen our city, if you're going to have a strong city, you have to focus on equity and opportunity. And schools are an elevator. Education is an elevator, and we need to be sure that we have strong neighborhood schools.
Stop before everybody starts chiming in. Specifics on development.
Yes.
And let's
So,
go to
can I talk
Susanna
about that?
next.
Yeah, I mean, I did put my hand up. I think that we need to.
Susanna, she pointed
Oh, I
to me.
thought she said me. I'm sorry. She did. See, she said me.
Let me finish.
Because
Let me
it's
finish
getting
on the
unruly.
development side.
I mean, I think.
If I could finish on the development side, because the second big thing we did was try to repopulate neighborhoods that had been struggling. And we built 1,500 units of housing. 1,500 units of housing. Most of it affordable rental, some of it mixed income. We worked with, and the first market rate housing in our communities in some of these communities in 70 years. And we worked with developers, local and citywide developers. We worked with the CHA. We worked to rebuild communities that had been struggling with demolition, with abandonment, with gang and drugs for decades. And I have the experience in working with communities and working with all of the actors to, as I said, to strengthen our neighborhood schools and to rebuild communities. And those are the critical issues that face the city as a whole.
All right. Okay. Sorry.
The issue that Lorraine first
It's
asked
economic
is,
development.
Chicago's had a history in the last 8 years of really emphasizing downtown with the idea
Yes,
that
exactly.
developed downtown is the engine of the city, the neighborhoods will thrive because of downtown. And the
Yes.
question on the
Trickle
table
down.
is, has that happened? And what more do we need to do for the neighborhood? So
Yeah.
my question is, my request is this. We'll try to get everybody's thoughts on this. And
Okay.
if you try not to talk over each other, and we'll take our time and get this one right. Okay?
Thank
Well,
you.
maybe part
Yes,
of
we
it is what I did when I was the alderman. Everybody knows I had the most diverse ward. Started in Bronzeville and went all the way out to East Garfield Park. But it's the simple things, making sure neighborhoods are clean, making sure the lights are on, stop signs are there, making sure we plant trees. I planted 1,400 trees when I was the alderman, 1,400 in 8 years. 350 of them were in a small area that burned up during the riots after Dr. King. Nothing was touched there. It's not all of a sudden we make a huge development. Every time I had a job, somebody came in that wanted to do something in the South or West Loop, I said, you've got to do something further out west. You've got to employ people from the community. I created and helped create 8,000 jobs. And it's the simple things that make a difference in the quality of life. To make sure that your street is safe, it's clean, it doesn't have rats running across it, the garbage is picked up. And you know what? You walk into some of these wards on the south and west sides, and you're wondering, what are they doing? We have to take away all that so-called authority from aldermen, and we've got to create individual districts. I mean, we're talking about aldermanic, the menu money. That's the most unfair, racist system that we have in that the city council allows.
Okay.
Some wards are this big,
Okay, we're
and
gonna move-
others are that big.
Thanks, Bob. Let's go to Paul. And once again, we want everybody to try to be concise.
Let me give you specifics.
Should have started here.
And I did this when I announced my Marshall Plan for the south and west sides. This is a resource allocation issue. First, you have opportunity zones. Bob has talked about it. Opportunity zones are these massive federal incentives. And there's 133 zones in Chicago. We should hold our noses and take full advantage of them because it's a way to get capital into these communities. Because the problem on the west side, you can tiff all you want on the west side, south side. No increment is growth, which means you're not going to be able to raise the capital. That's number one. Number two, and I've been talking about this since April, TIF fair share. You take a minimum, a third of all TIF revenues, you put it in an investment equity fund, and you invest on the west side and the south side. You invest that money. If you had $1 billion in equity investment from TIFs combined with $1 billion in private investment equity, you could raise $10 billion. These neighborhoods are capital starved. The third thing you do is you take these Amazon incentives that are on the books, property tax abatements, abatement of fees and fines. I think Amara has talked about that. And what you do is you envelope these new businesses located on the south side and on the west side with these tax incentives so they can start up. The fourth thing you do is you develop a buy Chicago, hire Chicago approach. Just as I took all the construction programs out of the Public Building Commission so I could bid them, and I insured the minority companies so they didn't have to go to Mickey Siegel or Near North Insurance to get their insurance. I insured them so that they can compete. But what you could do, just imagine if you applied those same minority and business set-asides with minority and business hiring to $20 billion in revenue, because the city controls $20 billion in revenue. You could incentivize developers just the way the CTA did when they negotiated a contract with that Chinese company to do their final assembly. So those are just 4 examples, concrete examples on how you could infuse money into these hard-pressed areas and provide incentives for businesses to locate in those areas.
Tell you what, how about Susana, and then we'll go to Gery Chico. Susana?
Lori
we'll
wanted to
get
talk too.
you.
Okay, yeah, again, to get into specifics, we need to leverage the downtown growth to reinvest in our neighborhoods, and we could do that through the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund. Paul talked about something I was going to talk about, which was the 133 opportunity zones, federal opportunity zones that we have to take advantage of. I'm from a neighborhood. I understand how neighborhoods work, and I think it's important that we have a mayor who gets that, not at the expense of the downtown, but in collaboration with the downtown. We also need to do a much better job of connecting the transportation system in this city so that it works for everyone in the city of Chicago. Right now, if we don't have manufacturing plants or a lot of job opportunities on the west and the south side, it's really even more so critical that the people who live on the west and the south side are able to access the jobs that could be available for them downtown. That's not happening either. The fact that Chicago only has 4 miles of dedicated bus lines, yet cities like New York have 83. I mean, they paint a very different picture. New York's 3 times the size. If we were going on ratios, they'd have 12 miles of dedicated bus lanes, but instead they have 83. Why? Again, because you have issues of aldermanic prerogative that stop those type of advancements from even happening in the city of Chicago because the aldermen are protecting their little fiefdom. So if we want to connect the whole city to opportunities in the whole city, we have to also invest in our infrastructure program. But again, we've got neighborhood opportunity funds that we can expand upon. And lastly, I also think that we do have TIFs that are sitting on a ton of money where there's no more future development happening in them. If we could change the state law that allows us to access those dollars and put them to work on the west and the south side for very needed developments, that's a really good opportunity of using dollars now. But we also, last thing I'm going to say is we have to acknowledge that we're suffering in large part because of a rigged and corrupt property tax system that was led and championed by Joe Barrios that Toni Preckwinkle, no offense, President Preckwinkle supported and gave him a lifetime achievement award.
So we want to move on to Gery Chico,
Yeah,
and then we'll go to Lori Lightfoot.
I'd like to see if she'll return, take that achievement award back. He doesn't deserve it.
Can I answer the question you posed, which is specifically What will we do to
It's not
generate
funny, it's
development
true.
on the west, south sides and other parts of the city? Look, for so long, this has gone unaddressed. But having been in real estate development for more than 30 years, I understand how to do this. I just was involved before I took my leave from my firm in North Lawndale, north of Sinai Hospital. 400 units of affordable housing with different income levels. 150,000 square feet of office and 20,000 square feet of retail. It's not just about housing. It's not just about retail. You need it all. People need to work. People need to shop. You want specific projects? Let's put this casino on the southeast side of the city.
Oh,
That
no,
has been-
bad idea.
Oh, really?
It's terrible,
Because-
Gary. You don't
Susanna,
want
Listen.
let
casino.
him finish.
Well, I
And
care about
frankly,
the people on the
alderman
southeast side of
the
wants
city,
it,
I'm
so
sorry.
You know what?
may
They
not
care
want it,
about
but the
themselves too.
alderman does.
And they tell me since the steel mills closed, they haven't had a genuine opportunity to get jobs. So we have to look at this. And if we're going to do battle with Indiana over the casino dollars, we better be near them. In addition to that, I want to propose a trade school with the trade unions on the west side of Chicago to create a campus. They want to invest. We want to invest. We should have our seniors graduating from high school with vocational certificates for apprenticeship ready to go. And then finally, you have to tie all this up. It's got to be federal resources like we got from the RPM transit TIF. That local money matched the federal money. We have a huge capital bill coming from J.B. Pritzker in the legislature, which we have to leverage. We can't just take one piece of it. We have to have local TIF sources. We have to have opportunity funds, and you need private capital.
Okay,
These
Lori.
projects are doable in specific places.
Okay, Lori?
So you've heard, I think, some ideas that make sense. Paul gave some, Susanna's given some. I agree with the TIF reform, the opportunity zones, and of course we need to make sure that we're infusing our high schools with vocational training. But there's a couple of things that the city can do right now that I think could make a huge difference. The city's buying power every single year is in excess of $2 billion. I know this from the time that I helped run the city's procurement department. We have to make sure that we are building capacity in the small business areas, in the neighborhoods, and not just downtown. One, we need to make sure that the contracts are small enough for small businesses to be able to be the primes on those contracts. And particularly for MBEs and WBEs, that's women-owned and minority-owned businesses. Number two, the city has to use the bully pulpit of the mayor's office to make sure that we are opening up opportunities for capital with the banks and other financial institutions. Now, Susanna mentioned the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund. The problem with that fund is it's a matching grant. So you can give away all the money, but if you are a small business and you don't have $100,000 to match the grant that you've been given, it's giving you zero. So we've got to change those to real grants and low interest loans right away. The other thing that the city can do is looking at the way that it procures goods and services. We have huge contracts with the IBMs of the world and other large vendors, but what we don't ask them is, what are your values when it comes to supplier diversity? And what that means is, are you also hiring small women and minority-owned businesses? We need to be partnering with people who share our values and, again, building wealth in the city. Also, what the city needs to be doing is providing incubators for small businesses all across the city in the neighborhoods so that the small businesses get access to peer-to-peer counseling, they get access to mentorship, they have an opportunity to develop business plans, marketing plans. Those are the kind of things that the city can do immediately today. But fundamentally, one last point. We are behind because the city hasn't led. We do not have a comprehensive economic development plan. We've left development to the vagaries of the developers. And what we've seen, frankly, is nothing south of Roosevelt Road, nothing west of Ashland, because the developers don't value those neighborhoods. If the city lead and built upon the quality of life plans that a lot of neighborhood organizations have put together with the assistance of LISC, we could add jet fuel to those plans and really, really invigorate those neighborhoods.
So let's go to Tom Frisbee for a question about police.
I'd like to address this to Bob Fioretti. You are one of the three candidates, along with John Kosler and Gary McCarthy, who are here this morning, who basically oppose the police consent decree. Can you explain why?
To oppose the what?
The police consent decree?
I don't oppose it. I mean, it will be instituted. The unfortunate thing about it, and I've read it a couple of times, if we would have had a professional police department from day one and professional leaders, all the items in the consent decree would have gone forward a long time ago. Look, we just had maybe our 7th suicide since June in the police department. What's causing that? We can talk about mental health and community relations, but we got to talk about the health of our own police officers. It boils down to hiring, and I was criticized when I talked about a diverse police department in 07, right when I was elected. And I made sure every time we had hiring, I leafleted my neighborhood to tell people to take the tests. It goes down to training. And we need training over and over. But more importantly, we need supervision. People like, there's several cases. There was one in the Trib on Sunday about the, which is the code of silence case. You know, the officers exhibited, and so did Van Dyke, the same problems. You get 2, 3, 4 lawsuits. Nobody calls you in and starts asking what's happening. I mean, it's a measure of professionalizing our department. And you know what? Morale is down. Why? Because it's run politically. It's run from the mayor's office, not the superintendent's. Gary McCarthy was run by the mayor, and what happened here in this city, and you know, Laquan McDonald's death could have been prevented if we would have looked at what the sources were. And you know, I do a lot of civil rights cases. I'm going to push that decree. But it's a $28 million tax right now, and I call it the McCarthy tax because it could have been avoided. All of this, all these lawsuits that we're talking about could have been avoided.
Excuse me, I think it's important to look at the consent decree through a public safety lens. You know, we should be very grateful to President Obama for, before he left office, asking the Department of Justice to look at the policies and procedures of our police department. And especially grateful to the activists who kept this issue alive as the mayor attempted to kind of damp things down. This is an historic first step. But I think we have to look at it in terms of police community relations. That has to be the focus. It can't be, you know, technology and drones and whatever. It has to be police community relations. And for 19 years as alderman of the 4th Ward, you know, I worked with commanders and officers on the street and community residents to try to keep our communities safe. And that's an ongoing battle, and it takes commitment on the part of our local elected officials as well as community residents. And I should say that, you know, many of our officers are good and decent people who struggle every day to do a difficult job well. It's hard to be a police officer. And I know Paul knows that because he's got a number of in his family. But we've got some real challenges in our police department, systemic challenges that we need to address. And they're evidenced by, you know, John Burge and Ron Watts and Detective Guevara and the code of silence. I mean, we really need to look carefully at the challenges that our police officers face and the ways in which we're going to address those challenges through an equity lens and through the lens of trying to be sure that the community is deeply involved. We cannot solve our problems by flooding our communities with police officers. We have to figure out how to better engage our communities. And I've supported, you know, citizen involvement through the GAP proposal to engage our citizenry and be sure that citizens are involved in the governance and
so we
accountability of our
we want to
police
hear
officers.
from Lori Lightfoot next, because frankly, of everybody who's running for mayor, I think she's most directly involved, has been most directly involved in police reform, running the police task force that led to all of these other steps and now the consent decree. So the question to you, Lori, is what's wrong with the consent decree?
Well, look, I think the fact that there's a consent decree, particularly given what Rahm Emanuel was trying to do before Lisa Madigan brought suit, is a good thing. But the consent decree has a lot of flaws in it. And I pointed those out. I have a 6-page single-space letter that I sent to the judge.
Just give 2 or 3.
Yeah, so here, the consent decree allows for chokeholds. That's Eric Garner. That's a problem. The consent decree allows for shooting into crowds. That's Betty Jones. That's a problem. The consent decree doesn't provide for a policy now on foot chases. We see almost once a month an officer giving pursuit of somebody who ditches a gun, and then the individual ends up getting shot, or worse, a bystander gets shot. This consent decree focuses too much time and energy on documenting policies. If you printed out all the general and special orders of the Chicago Police Department, you'd have a stack that's probably taller than I am at 5'1". Our problem isn't documenting policies. Our challenge is making sure that we're well-trained and that we're executing on the policies that are already available. The other thing is that the consent decree leaves things on the cutting room floor and doesn't include it. For example, the issue that we've been talking about before, the getting a handle on the out of control settlements, judgments, and police and attorney's fees. There's nothing about the consent decree that talks about it. It doesn't talk about civilian oversight. And I stood with the GAPA folks when they rolled out their ordinance back in the spring. The consent decree hopefully will actually start the process of transformation. But if we don't have a mayor who's committed, we don't have a mayor who understands the specifics of what needs to be done, we are going to waste and squander an opportunity like New Orleans did initially, like Cleveland did. We don't want to go through this process twice. It's going to be emotionally taxing. It's going to cost a lot of money. And it's critically important that we get it right. And obviously, given the work that I've done, and President Preckwinkle, with due respect, you always talk about the Obama DOJ, they followed our lead. The Police Accountability Task Force is the underpinnings for the DOJ report, is the underpinnings for some of the recommendations in the consent decree. We need to come together like we did with the task force and lead this process forward. That is the only way that we have any hope of success.
Paul Vallas?
Well, first of all, let me just say this about the consent decree. You can do a lot of things through departmental rules and regulations that don't have to be placed into the consent decree, whether it's chokeholds or whatever. You establish those rules and regulations. You reach out and you connect to the community and you make that happen. I think Lori would agree on that. But let me just say one thing. Let me say something about these lawsuits. Look, you've got to have the training, but you've got to understand that the lawsuit settlements is another cottage industry that has been created in this city. Because what people don't tell you is that close to $400 million in lawsuit settlements over the last 10, 12 years have been not related at all to the police department. And guess what? They have contracted out over $200 million to private law firms to go in and to settle those cases. Now, not the law firms that sued the city, the law firms that settled with the law firms that sued the city. So that's another cottage industry. And you're not going to get at that without a comprehensive training program, because 80% of what's in the consent decree, they should have been doing in the first place. I mean, something as basic as tasers. The night Laquan McDonald was killed, they were calling for a taser. They had 500 tasers in the whole police department. They had 15,000 tasers in New York. But the point that I want to make, though, here is in the law department, you want to get a handle? I mean, that's another cesspool that needs to be reassessed. I mean, you need risk management. You need a professional law department that is just not settling cases. They're not, I remember, and I'll tell you the honest to God truth, I walked out of the Department of Revenue once, and I slipped on a floor, and I went to break my floor because they were waxing the floor, and I shattered my elbow. And guess what? A prominent individual who remained unnamed told me that was a $90,000 settlement. That's a $90,000 broken elbow. I should go in and I should sue the city. And I didn't do it, so we need real reform in that law department too. But I want to make one more comment about the cops. We are not going to we've got to repair the damage done to the police department. Because if you don't fill vacancies, you don't have beat integrity, the community doesn't know the cops, and the cops don't know the community. If you don't have the sergeant ratios and the training officers, and I think we all agree on that, then you don't have command and control. If you don't have redundant training over and over and over again, and we can debate whether or not, I'm for a new academy, and I think you can monetize the new academy if it trains people throughout the region. But at the end of the day, I think we all agree that you need redundant training. My boys will tell you that. And finally, we need to get at this merit promotion system that really allows individuals who are not qualified to be promoted. We need more of a time and grade where you're actually promoting people to positions of responsibility who earn it. And I want to make one more comment if I can, please. When I was in the Chicago Public Schools, I opened 5 military high schools, and we have 42 ROTC programs, and there are 10,000 children in ROTC a year. 90% are Black and Latino. There's your pipeline for your next generation of first responders. Police, fire, EMT. I'm tired of hearing people say we can't find enough qualified Blacks, or they can't find enough qualified Latinos. Well, those kids in the ROTC programs, they have a 90% graduation rate. They don't have disciplinary problems, 90%. So you want to transform the police department? The next generation of police coming from the communities will be
I
transformational.
tell you what, let's do this. Lori, you want to add one more comment
And I'd
since
like to
you're,
add something. to
you
it
too,
also.
LaShawn. We'll do you two, and then we're going to move to another topic, and Tina. has a
Well,
question.
what I was going to say is look, the fundamental issue that still also isn't frankly addressed by the consent decree is changing the culture of the department. And how do you do that? The culture resides at the sergeant level. We are using an antiquated test to select sergeants. We are not training and selecting them in a way that makes sense for the job that they're actually charged to do. We're not holding them accountable. And if we don't do those things, which again, I don't know why the superintendent hasn't taken this on, it's something I've talked to him a lot about. It's not in the consent decree. We are not going to transform the department because we're going to do all these things. We're going to add more people into a fundamentally broken and flawed system where the sergeants can really do a lot to change the culture of the police department.
And LaShawn?
One of the things that the consent decree does not address is the fact that the police department is dealing in a racist way. In Chicago, about 72% of the stops are Black. About 17% are Latino. Victims with force, 76% of them are Black. That's a problem. So if we don't have critical race theory study for the police to be trained, it doesn't matter. All the training that we're talking about at this table, it doesn't matter because racism is at the heart of the problem in the city of Chicago's police department. So we have to deal with that.
Actually, the consent decree addresses both of those issues.
It doesn't talk about how to fix it and
No,
what they should
it
be
does
doing.
actually, Shawn, if you
No.
read it, there's specific programming that was a nationally recognized
It
program
doesn't talk
from the
directly
Department of
about
Justice
the-
that deals with
It doesn't
the
talk
issue
about
of
critical race
implicit,
theory
it
study.
deals with the issue of implicit bias,
But it
which is
doesn't
one of the
talk about
largest
critical
issues.
race theory so that they could be trained.
You can call it whatever you want, but the fact is, if you look at the written document, it actually addresses the very issues
It doesn't
that
call
you're
it.
talking
It
about.
doesn't call it racism.
Okay.
Shifting gears, I'd like to understand your policies on dealing with sexual harassment or even worse, assault within your staffs or some of you in the business world. At what point do you feel action should be taken? Does it require a police report? Does it require any sort of official report? And also, if you have dealt with this, do you feel that you have dealt with it properly?
I'd like to.
I
talk
have
about
a
this
response.
first. Well,
I have a
I
response.
started first on this one.
Sure,
And I
I'll
think
be
it's
next.
important.
How's
Yeah,
that?
I'm happy to do that. I think that this is a real serious issue. We're in a whole new era of the woman and of the Me Too, and where we should believe women when they come forward with their allegations. I have led a panel, the Anti-Sexual Harassment, Equality, and Access panel here in the state of Illinois, that dealt specifically with the issue of elevating women within politics, but also creating a safer workspace for them, and how you handle the issue of sexual harassment. And I'm very proud of the work that I've done. And we've, in my offices, both in the city clerk's office and in controller's office, we've had trainings regarding sexual harassment before this was a big public issue. I do know that we just finished talking about the code of silence with the police department, but there's been a code of silence with President Preckwinkle's office and how she's dealt with sexual harassment with her chief of staff, who she knew about it 6 months before she acknowledged. She actually lied to the press, not to me, but to the press corps when she said she didn't know about the allegations against her chief of staff. And it turns out she did know about those allegations and only came clean on them once it was discovered that she knew for 6 months. Worse yet, she tried to then impugn the reputation, and her people did, of the woman who brought that allegation forward. That is absolute failure of a high-ranking woman in elected office towards another woman who is a victim of sexual assault. And I think that that's shameful.
You know, look, as a woman, as a mother, I have no tolerance for sexual harassment. None.
Well, you
Zero
tolerated it for
tolerance.
6 months.
Would you
It's
please let me finish?
Sure.
Let her finish.
Well, she did. I mean,
Let her finish.
okay, please.
Thank you. You know, I got evidence of bad behavior on the part of my chief of staff. I fired him immediately. And would you mind giving me an opportunity to say what I have to say? I haven't interrupted you. All right, here's the deal. This is a critical issue, not just in government, but in business across the board. And what we did immediately was to put together a task force to look at the issue and how we could be sure that we were responding properly. And we did that both on the county government side, and we did that in the party side. The Democratic Party, in April, instituted a sexual harassment policy. And as things evolved over the next 6 months, we worked to try to improve that policy, and we created a task force in the party as well. So in both of my areas of responsibility, in county government and in the party, we've looked toward how we can strengthen our sexual harassment policies. And I think, frankly, the best way to deal with the challenges of sexual harassment is to promote and encourage women. Half of my bureau chiefs are women. 40% of my managers are women. 40% of my department heads are women. I think the way in which we can encourage and support women and provide them with leadership, and at the same time address some of these issues of sexual harassment, is provide them with opportunity. And I've done that across the board. I've also supported strong women as elected officials. You know, my chief of staff, Kim Fox, is now the state's attorney in Cook County. I supported a number of women in this last round, including Juliana Stratton when she first ran for state representative and then as lieutenant governor. So I've really made an effort not just to address the sexual harassment issue, which we've done through the task forces that I described and through our own ethics training, which preceded any of these incidents, but also in the opportunities that I've provided for women, both in county government and in the party. And I think I have a strong record on this. And, you know, and I think, you know, I'm being challenged by somebody on ethics issues who is, you know, who got married in Ed Burke's house, who is a protege and described Ed Burke as a mentor, as a protege of Michael Madigan, who's had some real challenges these days.
So let's go
you know,
back
I think
to
it's I think
Tina's
it's
question was
hypocritical.
specifically on the issue of
I think it's
sexual harassment.
hypocritical of her to challenge my record in that way.
Now countering, I think it's fair to say that at the end of the day, we heard a lot of noise, but the fact of the matter is that she announced her candidacy for mayor, having just had to fire her chief of staff, who she told the entire press corps she just found out about it. It turns out that she knew about it for 6 full months.
Excuse me.
And that you tried then to impugn.
You know,
the
we're not going to be
reputation of
able.
the
We're
women
not
who
going to
brought
be
it
able to
forth.
continue
And at
this.
the end of the day, I'm not the one who's listed in a criminal complaint by the
respond.
FBI about having received an illegal contribution from an
No, you're
extortion
mentioned in the
scheme.
Danny Solis
And then
case.
also,
So let me
by
just
the way,
Susanna,
failed
we have to
to
move.
return
Excuse me.
$160,000.
Susanna, we have to move on. We're running out of
That's
time
fine,
here.
but I'm just saying.
Gery Chico, do you
knew
want to talk
about it
about
for
the
6
general
months.
issue of
All right,
sexual
We're at
harassment?
the
in City Hall?
15-minute warning.
Yes.
I'm putting on my
I wanted to
management hat
answer,
here.
Tina's
15
question.
minutes.
She asked a very important question. I think you asked about how do you bring forward a culture that would prevent this. In my law firm, we have an employment practice that actually trains companies, including our own, about what to do to establish a culture with policies and procedures to try to prevent sexual harassment. I think it's very important. We could talk about it. I think we do have to model behavior, but at the same time, I mean, right on our wall when you walk in our campaign,
How
is the
big is your law firm, by the way?
22 people,
How many are women and how many are men?
50-50.
Okay.
They're roughly about 50-50. And I found it very interesting, the number of companies that were coming to us asking us for sexual harassment training. And one of my partners at the time, Sandy Morris, would go out and talk to these companies, and they'd have the entire core of leadership of those companies there. And a lot of it was in some of the hard industries where there was a lot of men. And you had to go in there and you had to establish the rules and what the procedures and policies would be so that women aren't taken advantage of. I think it's very important. To your point, you said, how aggressive do you need to be? Very aggressive.
Can I weigh in on this question? Look, fundamentally, having worked in the corporate world and worked in a lot of male-dominated areas as a lawyer, prosecutor, when I worked at the police department, and frankly, been a victim of sexual harassment myself, fundamentally, the problem remains that we still have institutions that open up the doors for women, but are still structured on a male paradigm, meaning the hours that you're expected to work, ignore the fact that women are still the primary caretakers of their children. And yes, of course, it's important to have diversity and inclusion and have more women at the top. But if we don't make sure that from the beginning of people's onboarding in an institution that they understand and respect diversity, we're never going to make significant progress on this. When I started working at the police department, investigating police-involved shootings, being in the middle of the night in some of the most far-flung areas of the city, I had a police commander who would sexually harass me in front front of everybody. He was trying to humiliate me. You know, I don't know that he actually wanted anything from me other than to demean me and demoralize me in front of most of the men that were there. Luckily, my mother trained me well. And so after a couple of incidents of this, I said to him in very colorful language that he did knock it off. I was going to make sure that I heard him professionally. But a lot of women don't feel like they have that voice. And that's why it's so important at the top, in the middle, in the entry level, that we infuse every organization with respect for diversity of all types, and particularly gender diversity.
LaShawn, did you have something you wanted to say
No,
about
it's
this?
simple, zero tolerance. I mean, you have to, as the mayor, you have to have a zero tolerance across the board in all departments. And there must be consequences to deal with the, with any actions that violates the rules. And that, I think when you send a strong message, whether it's in the police department with misconduct or in the workplace with sexual harassment, and the workers know that there's a zero tolerance, I think it sends a strong message.
I have a follow-up for you and for Ms. Lightfoot. I see you guys as social justice warriors, and I think it's very admirable. But what about being able to manage a city, you know, and all the people that you'll have to oversee? Can you tell us why you're qualified to lead in that way, outside of social justice issues?
Was a senior executive in the police department. Ran an organization within the police department that frankly had one of the hardest jobs in the city. That's investigating police misconduct. I helped lead the city's 911 center, which has 11 different unions and a lot of complicated functions there. I went into the city's procurement department at one of the toughest times, revamped the certification and compliance for minority business and women-owned businesses, and frankly helped right the ship with procurement that was broken and dysfunctional. In my professional life, in my law firm, I've helped lead initiatives within the department, within the law firm. I was the head of diversity and inclusion in my law firm, and I acted as in-house general counsel to my management committee on very tough issues related to criminality and other things that frankly related to our clients. So and obviously police board in the task force in some of the most difficult and distressing circumstances. I've stepped up and I've led. I haven't worried about the political consequences. I've done hard work, taken on very tough challenges, frankly, other people shied away from because it was necessary and right. And I felt like, as a person who's been very fortunate in my life, coming from a poor family that struggled every single day, that I had the obligation and responsibility to give back as much as I could and to be a leader.
Well, you know, what I have with Springfield's experience, you have to have someone that understands how to get things done. Many of the problems facing the city of Chicago is going to take someone that could get things done in Springfield. When we talk about the police contract, we have to have someone that understands how to go to Springfield to help change that. When you talk about bringing more funding to the city of Chicago for education, you have to have someone that could go to Springfield and bring that money back. When you talk about developing the communities on the south and west side, you have to have someone that could negotiate down in Springfield and in Washington to bring capital money back to the city of Chicago to develop it. When you talk about making sure that you have someone at the helm that's not going to say that he or she knows everything, that he or she could fix these problems alone, but that you're going to bring the wealth of this city together to help solve these problems. When you have a person that believes that they have all the answers, that's the problem that we have in this city right now. And I know that I don't have all the answers, but I have solutions, and I know how to bring people together in this city to make sure that it's fair and equitable.
Mr. Chico and then Mr. Vallas.
Marlon, I've been privileged to lead 5 governments in local and at the state level. And in each one, there's a principle that starts with good management in each of those places, and that's recruitment of excellent team. No one person does this. If you're a mayor, you have a cabinet, and you go out and you recruit the best people you can find. I've been privileged to work with a lot of excellent people. Same thing at the Chicago Park District, Chicago Public Schools. I think Paul and his team did an outstanding job. Same thing at the State Board of Education. It all starts with team. No one person can get this job done. I've delivered results at each of those places I've been, in addition to the private sector at my firm for the last 16 years. And I think that I bring the experience that blends both knowing how to run a business and make payroll every 2 weeks with running organizations as large as the city of Chicago, sitting right next to Mayor Daley for a number of years, operating the city.
But I guess I wonder with you, would you be as good on social justice as Lori Lightfoot?
Oh, I think
and
so.
Shawn Ford?
Let me
I didn't finish
speak.
about my experience with
Possibly.
my own business also, but go ahead.
But with regard to social justice, everything I've done has been through that lens. You can't be in the city of Chicago without caring about people in all four
Oh, yeah,
corners
you
of this. Pardon?
Oh, yeah, you can. It happens every,
Well,
sadly,
you
it
can
happens
speak
every
when it's
single
your
day.
turn. But I'm saying that every time I've stepped up to try to lead one of these governments, we've always cared about people in every part of this city. You do your best to try to incorporate everybody and make opportunity for people throughout the city.
Thank you.
You know, let me respond. I've been doing multi-billion-dollar turnaround projects since I was city budget director in the 90s, and I had the privilege and the pleasure of working with Toni Preckwinkle on so many things. But, you know, CPS, 1.4 billion, deficit, $1 billion cash balance, 70,000 more kids than today, 90% of kids in either new or renovated buildings. And then, you know, after challenging the organization and losing against Rob Blagojevich by 1.5 percentage points, I went and I did similar improvements in Philadelphia. 5 out of 6 years, balanced budget, $17 billion, 1.7 billion in school construction. Then I rebuilt an entire city after Hurricane Katrina from scratch, literally, because 90% of the schools had been seriously damaged or destroyed altogether. And then I didn't go to consult in heaven. I went to Haiti, I went to Chile, and I spent about a year working in the Justice Department for Sally Yates on prison reform, on how to revamp education and occupational training. Every single district I've taken over in every country that I've visited have been, entities that have been on the verge of financial collapse, either by human disasters or by natural disasters. And in every single school district I've run, between 85 to 90% of those children have been Black or Latino. I have built $7 billion in new schools and renovated schools, and 90% of those schools have been in the poorest communities. So at the end of the day, and 75% of my senior administrators at all levels in aggregate have been minority, and a vast majority of those have been women. So the point is, I think I've demonstrated my ability to manage multi-billion-dollar budgets, and I think I've demonstrated my ability to manage those budgets and in a way that equitably shared resources for those who were in the greatest need.
Paul,
Thank
can
you.
you quickly, can you address your time at Chicago State, how you got there under Governor Rauner, and what's the status of that campus right now?
Yeah, well, right now, Governor Rauner asked me to originally serve on the board, and then an advisory committee that he had set up asked me to take over as interim president, which of course the board was not supportive of, and then to stay on to try to keep the university financially afloat. As you know, I ran against the governor, and I spent about a year calling him some pretty nasty names. That was my mission in the election. So I was surprised when he asked me to participate. But when I left the university, I think they had a $24 million cash balance, and the new enrollment began to grow. A part of it was the fact that they finally passed a budget. So right now, the university is under, I think, excellent leadership. They've made a number of personnel changes, which I could not have been able to make short of being president of the university. But, I think the mission was accomplished. I was actually working on a limited contract, and I actually left before that contract was done. But the bottom line is, he did not want to close the university. You can question his motivations yourself, but he did not want to close the university. And I think we successfully kept the university open, kept it afloat. And if anyone wants to look at the strategic plan that I developed for the university, you can go online because it's all there laid out.
Okay, so we are out of time. I wish we could talk more. Actually, I was hoping we'd run out of questions early because I was going to ask a real softball question. I was going to ask you, what do you love about Chicago? Because I figure everybody who gets to where you folks are, it's not just about fixing things. There's something you feel a passion. We're not even going to ask you that question. We're going to day.
So easy, we can do it.
2 minutes remaining in the period.
Well,
Tom
very
McNamee.
quickly. I don't know if you can do it fairly in 2 seconds. But
Everybody gets 30 seconds. I got my watch set. Gery Chico, go.
Having lived in 9 neighborhoods, I love the neighborhoods and the people that come from them from around the world.
Yeah, me too.
I love the communities, our architecture, our museums, and our schools and universities.
I like the $650+ billion economy. It gives everyone hope and a possibility, but you got to have a mayor that understands fairness and equity in this city. I like the hope that this city can have.
I love its diversity. I think it's one of the most beautiful things about Chicago. And I think that with that diversity comes just a better understanding of people as a whole. And by the way, the diversity brings great food.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we haven't talked about is an incredible thriving arts community and the way that that community contributes exponentially to the bottom line of the city, but also just gives a vibrancy and a texture that without it, we'd be a very different place.
We live in an absolutely beautiful city with fascinating neighborhoods. I love the fact that you can sort of visit around the world as you go to the neighborhoods in the city of Chicago. And I think one of our great strengths is the diversity of our economy. We are a much more diverse place in terms of opportunity than even New York or Los Angeles for the workers who are here. And I think that's a real blessing to all of us.
I like its citizens. When I was school chief, I visited over 400 schools, and I think probably over 500 local school council meetings. And I love the interaction. And I always tell people, I don't think I ever had a bad day because Chicagoans are great. They're courteous. They're respectful. And the amazing thing about the community, particularly sometimes the poorest communities, is the people who have the least sometimes are most appreciative. So I don't think I've ever had a bad day. And I always immerse myself into communities to kind of get rejuvenated, so to speak. So that's what I love best about Chicago.
Well, I've had a lot of bad days, but not today.
No.
Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you.